On the morning of October 13th, 1841, Hartford's high society gathered at Trinity Episcopal Church for what was meant to be a dazzling wedding. But within minutes, it turned into a nightmare that the city would never forget. 19-year-old Bridget O'Sullivan, radiant in her gown, took her first sip of ceremonial wine and suddenly collapsed at the altar, her body shaking violently as foam spilled from her lips. Guests froze in shock as her final words slipped out in a weak whisper, "The wine, it burns." 3 days later, investigators uncovered a truth so chilling that the Hartford Courant refused to print all the details, fearing it would ignite public fury. The poisoner had sat quietly among the guests, calmly watching the young bride die in agony, each step of the plan executed with ruthless precision. Before diving deeper into the tragedy that bound the O'Sullivan family to the powerful Petons, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and share in the comments what city or state you're tuning in from. Your support helps us revive these long-buried American mysteries. What happened that autumn morning was more than a murder. It was the unraveling of a tangled web of jealousy, desperation, and control that would forever alter Hartford's elite. In 1841, the city was in transition, caught between the old traditions of New England and the new opportunities of industry. The Connecticut River carried steamboats up from New York, while fresh-built factories lined its banks, their smokestacks competing with the church spires. The population had grown to nearly 13,000, fueled by Irish immigrants who arrived to take hard labor jobs on railroads and in mills. Among Hartford's established families, none stood taller than the Petons. At the head of the household was Elelena Peton, a widowed matriarch of 48, who ruled from her stately brick mansion on Prospect Street. With its pristine gardens and iron fencing, her home was a monument to the old Connecticut elite wealth stability and social dominance. Eleanor had not been born into privilege, but her marriage to Jonathan Peton, heir to a shipping and insurance fortune, had elevated her into Hartford's upper class. Their union, based on love rather than pedigree, had once raised eyebrows, but Jonathan's financial success silenced the doubters. After his sudden death in 1835, Eleanor inherited an estate worth about $40,000, making her one of the wealthiest women in Connecticut. Her world revolved around her only surviving child, William, whom she saw as a miracle after multiple miscarriages. William grew into a tall, intelligent young man, Yale-educated and admired across Hartford as one of its most eligible bachelors. By 1839, he was working in the family's businesses, and Eleanor guarded both his future and the Peton legacy with fierce determination. Meanwhile, the Irish migration to Hartford surged. Whole families crowded into shabby tenements near the railroad depot, laboring long hours for meager wages. Their presence sparked resentment among native-born residents who whispered about the so-called Irish problem. At gatherings of the Ladies' Aid Society, Eleanor heard complaints about Irish servants accused of theft, about immigrant children brawling in the streets, about entire families squeezed into single rooms. The distrust grew as the city's old elite wondered whether these Catholic newcomers could ever truly belong. It was into this world of suspicion and shifting fortunes that Patrick O'Sullivan arrived in 1839, a 38-year-old widower with 4 children. His eldest, Bridget, was just 17 when they came to Hartford. With her striking auburn hair and piercing green eyes, she stood out even in the gray chill of Connecticut winters. A beauty whose future would soon collide with the ambitions of one of Hartford's most powerful families. Patrick O'Sullivan secured steady work as a supervisor at Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, where his experience from Dublin's textile mills gave him an edge. The pay allowed him to move his family into a modest but respectable home on Front Street, closer to Hartford's center than most Irish newcomers could afford. Bridget found work as a seamstress at an upscale dress shop on State Street, where her skill with fabrics and her light Irish accent made her a favorite with customers. Her path crossed with William Peaton's one evening at Wadsworth Athenaeum during a lecture on American literature delivered by a visiting Harvard professor. Bridget sat in the section reserved for working-class attendees, listening intently. When the floor opened for questions, she stood and asked about the influence of Irish poetry on American writers. Her voice was calm, her words thoughtful, and heads turned in surprise. Afterward, as she gathered her cloak, William approached hat in hand. "That was an excellent question," he said warmly. "I'm William Peaton. I don't believe we've met." Bridget flushed, but answered steadily, "Bridget O'Sullivan, Mr. Peaton. A pleasure." They walked together toward State Street, their conversation flowing easily from books to ideas. William learned she had read widely despite little formal schooling, borrowing works from priests in Dublin and from Hartford's lending libraries. Impressed by her intellect, he hesitated when their paths parted before asking, "Would you join me at next week's lecture on American history? I think you'll find it interesting." Bridget's smile lit her face. "I would enjoy that very much, Mr. Peaton." Their quiet courtship began. Though William understood the risks of pursuing an Irish working girl, Bridget's wit and warmth convinced him that love outweighed society's rules. They strolled the riverbanks, attended lectures, and grew closer with each passing week. For nearly 6 months, Eleanor Peaton remained unaware. She assumed William's absences were tied to business or social duties among Hartford's elite. That illusion shattered on a stifling afternoon in July 1840. Intending to surprise her son at his office, she arrived carrying a pitcher of lemonade and news of an invitation to the governor's reception. But on the second-floor landing, she froze as voices drifted through his closed door. William's baritone was clear. "My mother will never accept this." "Bridget, but I don't care. I love you, and that's what matters." Eleanor's grip tightened on the pitcher until her knuckles whitened. Then came Bridget's reply, gentle but firm. "I don't want to be the cause of trouble between you and your mother, William. She sacrificed so much for you." William's voice sharpened. "You don't understand. She's controlled every decision in my life since Father died. Who I should marry, where I should live, everything. I'm 23 and I've never chosen for myself. That ends now." Eleanor pressed against the wall, her heart hammering, as Bridget asked when he would tell his mother. Soon, William promised. "I want her to meet you properly as the woman I'll marry. She'll see your intelligence and your strength. She'll have no choice but to accept." The scrape of a chair sent Eleanor fleeing. She left the lemonade abandoned on the stairs, hurried to her carriage, and collapsed inside, trembling. By the time she reached Prospect Street, her shock had hardened into fury. An Irish girl, her William heir to the Peaton fortune, intended to throw away everything she had built on this immigrant seamstress. In her mind, Bridget was no innocent. She was a schemer who had ensnared William to elevate herself. That evening at dinner, William appeared happier than he had in months, humming as he carved the roast. Eleanor studied him across the table, rage simmering beneath her calm expression. She wanted to confront him, to crush his foolish romance immediately. But years of maneuvering had taught her patience. Eleanor knew she could not strike without first understanding the scope of her enemy. That evening over dinner, she tested the waters. "You seem in excellent spirits tonight, William," she said casually. "Do I?" he replied, his eyes alight. "Well, I suppose I am. I've been thinking about making some changes in my life. Important changes." She raised her brows, feigning interest. "Oh, and what sort of changes?" William carefully set down his fork, then met her gaze squarely. "Mother, I've met someone. A young woman of remarkable character and intelligence. I believe she may be the one I want to marry." Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her water glass. "How wonderful, dear." "Anyone I know?" William drew a steadying breath. "No, but I'm eager for you to meet her. Her name is Bridget O'Sullivan. She's from Ireland. Her family came here 2 years ago." The glass slipped from Eleanor's hand and shattered on her plate. She forced a brittle laugh, rising to summon the servants. "How clumsy of me." Her voice sharpened as she repeated, "O'Sullivan, you said an Irish family?" William nodded. "Yes. Her father works at Colt's factory. Bridget is employed at Mrs. Hendriss's dress shop. Mother, I know what you're thinking, but I'm not thinking anything." "William," she cut in tone icy but controlled. "I'm simply surprised. You've never mentioned her before." "I wanted to be certain first," William said firmly. "And I am. I love her, Mother. I intend to ask for her hand." That night, Eleanor paced her private sitting room until she wore a visible track in the Persian carpet. Each of William's words replayed in her mind like hammer blows. He loved her. He intended to marry her. The consequences were unthinkable. A marriage to an Irish immigrant would reduce William's social standing to ashes. The best families would turn their backs on him. Their children, her grandchildren, would bear the stain of divided heritage never truly accepted by either side. Worse still, this girl would gain legal rights to the Peaton fortune. She could divert funds to Catholic parishes, to immigrant relatives, to reckless ventures. Eleanor had clawed her way from merchant's daughter to society matron. She would not watch an Irish seamstress undo her life's work. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor quietly investigated. Patrick O'Sullivan was known as dependable, though whispers tied him to labor agitation. Bridget, though praised by her employer, was gossiped about by Hartford matrons who muttered that an Irish girl had no business putting on airs. Eleanor discovered the family's ties to Holy Trinity Church, the Catholic parish eyed with deep suspicion by Hartford Protestants. The thought of her heirs kneeling before a foreign pope filled her with disgust. Meanwhile, William grew bolder. He brought Bridget to public events, introduced her with open pride, and ignored the stiff politeness masking society's whispers. By early September, he had made up his mind. Over breakfast, he told Eleanor, "I've spoken with Mr. O'Sullivan. He's given me permission to ask Bridget for her hand. I intend to propose tonight." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "William, I must ask you to reconsider." He bristled. "Mother, please let me finish. I've said nothing about this because I hoped it would pass, but marriage is another matter. This will affect our family's future." "And what exactly are you saying?" he demanded. "That marriage is about more than love. It is about compatibility, shared values, background. This young woman may be pleasant, but she comes from a world wholly unlike ours. Differences that charm you now will become conflicts later." William's eyes flashed. "Her background doesn't matter to me." "It should," Eleanor shot back. "It will matter to your children, to your associates, to everyone we know." William shoved back his chair, anger sharp in his voice. "I'm disappointed in you. I thought better of someone who once married for love." Eleanor's composure cracked. "That was different. Your father and I shared common expectations. This girl will change you, William, and not for the better." "This conversation is over," he said coldly. "I will propose tonight with or without your blessing." When the engagement of William Peaton and Bridget O'Sullivan appeared in the Hartford Courant on September 15th, 1840, the single-column announcement created a sensation. At tea tables and club rooms, the city's elite debated whether William had lost his senses or simply fallen prey to Irish enchantment. For Eleanor, the printed words marked a point of no return. She could not argue, she could not plead. If she wanted to preserve the Peaton name and fortune, she would have to act. Eleanor wore the mask of gracious acceptance, but behind it her fury only deepened. At dinners and receptions, she endured the polite congratulations of friends whose words dripped with veiled pity. How forward-thinking of William, they would say, their smiles tight, their eyes gleaming with gossip. The cruelest cut came during a Ladies' Aid Society meeting when Mrs. Harrison Fitzgerald, whose own Irish bloodline Hartford conveniently ignored, remarked on the need for proper standards in marriage. "Of course, charity toward immigrant families is essential," she added sweetly, glancing at Eleanor. "But there are boundaries that should never be crossed." Eleanor forced a brittle smile, but inside she seethed. The women who once deferred to her were now mocking her, treating the Peaton name as the punchline of their whispers. She turned her scrutiny toward Bridget, observing her with the cold calculation of a general sizing up an enemy. At lectures, at social outings, at church services, Eleanor studied every movement, every word. What she saw unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Bridget carried herself with unteachable grace. Her speech was articulate, her warmth drew people in. Even society matrons known for cruelty acknowledged the girl's poise. Most damning of all was William's devotion. The way he softened his stride to match hers, the way his entire attention fixed on her when she spoke, the fierce defense he offered. When others made cutting remarks, it all reminded Eleanor uncomfortably of how Jonathan had once shielded her from criticism in their early years. The wedding was set for October 13th. William, preferring intimacy, had suggested a smaller ceremony, but Bridget insisted on something more open. "I want everyone to see we have nothing to hide," she told him. That insistence struck Eleanor like a blade. A public wedding meant that Hartford's finest would gather not to celebrate, but to gawk, to whisper, to measure just how far the Peaton name had fallen. She imagined the looks, the smirks, the relentless discussion afterward. It would ruin her permanently. Her mind turned to possible tactics. She might feign illness, forcing William to delay. She might bribe Patrick O'Sullivan into withdrawing consent. She might even threaten to disinherit William outright. But each path carried too much risk. William could marry Bridget regardless, and disinheritance would only strip Eleanor of the one weapon she still held control of, the fortune. None of these options would guarantee the outcome she required. Then, one restless night in early October, while poring over her late husband's old business files, she found her solution. Among Jonathan's correspondence were letters from a New York associate who dealt in industrial chemicals. One particular exchange chilled her. It described arsenic oxide, a white crystalline powder once considered for fabric treatment. The notes detailed its qualities: easily dissolved, nearly tasteless when mixed with strong flavors, its effects swift and devastating, yet easily mistaken for natural illness. Most importantly, the letter explained that detection required advanced chemical testing, almost never performed in cases of sudden death. Eleanor read the words again and again, her pulse quickening. The answer had been here all along. A sudden collapse at the altar could be explained away as nerves weakness or fate. The death would be tragic, yes, but not suspicious. The family name would remain unsullied, and William, though broken, would survive to marry again, this time properly. The plan formed with chilling clarity. She would obtain the compound, under the guise of continuing Jonathan's unfinished business. She would find her moment during the ceremony, and she would play the role of grieving mother-in-law to perfection. On October 8th, just 5 days before the wedding, Eleanor boarded a train to New York, dressed in respectable black, and carrying Jonathan's letters as proof of her purpose. At Hartwell Chemical Supply, she met Mr. Hartwell himself, a nervous man with wire spectacles who remembered her late husband fondly. "A cautious man, your husband," he said, "always concerned about safety." Eleanor smiled thinly. Indeed. I'm simply finishing his work evaluating whether his proposed investment in fabric treatment was sound. She produced the letters, spoke fluently about the technical details she had studied night after night, and when she requested arsenic oxide, Hartwell scarcely blinked. Yes, Mrs. Peaton. Your husband inquired about it some years ago. I'll have the order prepared at once. Eleanor's movements were measured, her face serene, as she stepped toward the communion table. The silver chalice gleamed beneath the light filtering through the stained glass windows, a vessel meant for blessing, but destined to become an instrument of death. With a subtle adjustment of her sleeve, she freed the sachet from her dress pocket. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she tilted it, the fine white powder slipping silently into the rich red wine. She stirred it in, with a natural motion of adjusting the chalice's position, her body shielding the act from curious eyes. To any observer, she looked like a devoted mother ensuring that her son's wedding ran smoothly. Father Matthews lifted the chalice moments later, unaware that it now held not only sacred wine, but also a lethal dose of arsenic oxide. Eleanor returned to her seat, her expression calm, her heart pounding with the certainty of what was about to unfold. She told herself this was salvation, not murder. Her son would be spared disgrace, and her family's legacy would remain intact. The priest offered a final blessing, then extended the chalice to the bride. Bridget accepted it with both hands, her smile radiant as she raised the cup to her lips. William watched her with tender pride, utterly oblivious. Eleanor fixed her gaze on the girl, waiting for the powder to take hold, waiting for proof that her desperate plan had succeeded. The first swallow seemed ordinary enough, but within seconds Bridget's expression faltered. She pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes wide in sudden alarm. A faint cough escaped her lips, then another harsher this time. The chalice slipped from her hands, striking the stone floor with a ringing crack as dark wine spilled like blood across the altar steps. Gasps echoed through the church as Bridget staggered, her white gown twisting around her legs before she collapsed at William's feet. A low murmur rippled through the pews, confusion giving way to panic as Bridget convulsed, foam rising at the corners of her mouth. The priest knelt beside her, muttering prayers, while William cradled her in his arms, his voice breaking as he begged her to hold on. Through the chaos, Eleanor remained seated in the front pew. Her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her face carefully composed into the mask of a horrified mother-in-law. Bridget's final words came in a choked whisper, audible only to those closest to the altar. The wine, it burns. A shudder passed through her body, and then she was still. William clutched her lifeless form, his anguished cries filling the vaulted church, while guests stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend the tragedy that had just unfolded before their eyes. Eleanor lowered her gaze, hiding the flicker of triumph behind her veil of grief. The plan had worked. The Irish girl was gone. And though the scandal of her death would shake Hartford, Eleanor believed it would fade in time. What mattered was that her son's future and the Peaton name had been secured. Eleanor froze mid-step, her pulse hammering in her ears. For a long, dreadful moment, she could not tell whether the commotion was a false alarm or the long-awaited collapse of her rival. She smoothed her skirts, composed her face into the mask of dignified concern, and hurried back toward the drawing room. The scene that greeted her was one of growing chaos. Guests had pulled back from the center of the room where Bridget stood pale, now her hands clutching at her stomach. The sparkle in her eyes had dulled, replaced by confusion and pain. William knelt beside her, his arm wrapped around her waist, begging her to sit to rest. Bridget shook her head weakly, gasping, "No, I'm fine, just the excitement," before a violent cough racked her body. The laughter and clinking of glasses had vanished, replaced by whispers and anxious glances. Mrs. Harrison Fitzgerald, always quick to dramatize, pressed a handkerchief to her lips and declared in a tremor of horror, "She's fainting." Bridget swayed, her complexion ashen, then collapsed against William's chest. He cradled her with desperation, calling out for a physician. "Someone fetch Dr. Harrison," he shouted, his voice breaking. Guests surged toward the doors, their fine shoes scuffing the parquet floors, while the younger O'Sullivans wept openly. Eleanor stepped forward with perfect timing, placing herself at William's side. "My dear, keep calm," she said softly, her hand on his shoulder as though to steady him. "It may only be a fainting spell from the heat." Her words carried just enough authority to soothe even as Bridget's lips parted in a desperate whisper. Those nearest leaned in and heard it clearly. "The wine, it burns." A hush fell over the room. For an instant, no one moved. Then Bridget's body convulsed violently, white foam frothing at her mouth. The guests gasped in unison, some crossing themselves, others recoiling in fear. Dr. Harrison, arriving breathless, pushed through the crowd and knelt at Bridget's side. He pressed fingers to her pulse, examined her eyes, and ordered the room cleared. "Give her air," he barked. But his expression told the truth. He had little hope. William's anguished cries filled the chamber as he rocked Bridget in his arms, whispering frantic pleas for her to hold on. Within minutes, her spasms subsided. Her body went still. Silence settled like a pall. The bride was gone. Guests stood frozen, horrified witnesses to what had begun as Hartford's most talked-about wedding and ended in its darkest scandal. Some women sobbed quietly. Men shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to remain or to flee. Dr. Harrison straightened slowly, his face grave. "It was sudden," he said carefully. "The heart, perhaps. Or some hidden weakness." He avoided William's eyes. Eleanor, standing tall and composed, allowed a single tear to trace down her cheek. It was the perfect picture of maternal grief, even as a cold satisfaction stirred beneath her sorrowful mask. 3 days later, the truth would begin to surface. Whispers in Hartford's parlors and taverns alike turned to poison, to deliberate malice, to the chilling possibility that the radiant Irish bride had been murdered before the eyes of the city's finest. The drawing room had gone deathly still. Only Bridget's ragged breathing and William's choked reassurances broke the silence. Dr. Harrison knelt closer, his lined face shadowed with grim certainty. "Mr. Peaton, I need that chalice," he said firmly. "If there are traces in the wine, we must know immediately." His words carried the authority of a man who had seen too many patients die for want of timely truth. William nodded, his face pale, and motioned for a servant to hurry back to Trinity. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her cheeks. If the chalice returned and was examined, everything she had so carefully planned would collapse. Yet to object further would be to expose herself. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips, forcing tears to her eyes, and whispered, "Surely there must be some mistake." Bridget tried to sit forward, but slumped back against the chair, her strength ebbing. Her lips moved faintly, and those nearest leaned in to hear. "The wine, it burned." The words were barely audible, but they struck like a hammer against Eleanor's composure. William clutched her tighter, his voice breaking. "She said it again, Doctor. She keeps saying it was the wine." Dr. Harrison turned his gaze on Eleanor. Not unkind, but sharp, assessing, weighing. "Mrs. Peaton," he said, "you procured the wine, yes. You oversaw its preparation." His tone was neutral, but the implication hung heavy in the air. All eyes shifted toward her. Society friends who just hours earlier had offered polite congratulations now watched with something colder in their expressions: suspicion. Eleanor drew herself up with practiced dignity. Of course I oversaw it, as any mother would. The wine was a gift chosen to honor this day. Do you truly think I would endanger my own son and his bride? She let the words tremble as though the accusation wounded her deeply. Yet she could feel the tide turning. For the first time, whispers were no longer about William's unwise choice of bride. They were about her. Dr. Harrison did not press further, but his silence was damning. "We must wait for the chalice," he said, at last returning his attention to Bridget, who was now trembling violently. "Until then, keep her calm. Keep her still." He barked another order for mustard water, for anything to force vomiting. But it was already too late. Bridget's breaths came shallow and uneven, her eyes glassy, her skin clammy to the touch. William's voice cracked as he bent low over her. "Stay with me, Bridget. Please, love, stay with me." But within minutes, the young bride gave a final shudder and fell still in his arms. The wails of her siblings rose from the back of the room, and Hartford's finest, who had come to witness a marriage, now bore witness to a death. Dr. Harrison stood slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth with deliberate care. "I fear there is nothing more we can do," he announced to the hushed room. Then, after a long pause, his eyes swept the assembled guests. This was no fainting spell. This was no weakness of the heart. This young woman was poisoned. The words spread like wildfire through the mansion. Eleanor felt the weight of 100 stares, each one sharp enough to pierce the mask she had so carefully constructed. And somewhere in her chest, beneath the layers of composure, calculation, and cold resolve, flickered the first true ember of fear. Eleanor's stomach dropped as Bridget's eyes opened. For hours she had clung to the belief that death would silence the girl forever, that the poison would finish its work before medicine could interfere. Now, with Bridget breathing weak but alive, terror gripped her more fiercely than ever. If Bridget remembered the chalice, if she repeated her dying whispers with clarity, Eleanor's carefully woven facade would unravel in an instant. William's face lit with fragile hope. He kissed Bridget's hand, his voice shaking. "You're safe, my love. You're safe now." Bridget blinked at him, then at the others gathered in the room. Her lips parted as though she meant to speak again. But Dr. Harrison raised a steadying hand. "Rest now, Mrs. Peaton. Don't strain yourself. You've endured a grave ordeal." He looked at William, his expression grave. "Her recovery is not certain. The poison has done terrible damage. But if she survives the night, her chances will improve." Eleanor forced herself to step forward, arranging her features into a mask of maternal concern. She touched Bridget's damp brow with her gloved hand, every gesture designed to mimic affection. "My dear, you frightened us all so terribly. We thought we had lost you." Bridget's fevered eyes met hers, and for a moment Eleanor feared the young woman could see through the mask, straight into the heart of her murderous intent. Bridget whispered something faint, too soft for the others to catch. But Eleanor leaned close and heard the words, clear as bells, the wine. It burned. Dr. Harrison's sharp eyes flicked toward Eleanor, his suspicion hardening. He had the chalice, he had the chemical proof, and now he had the bride's own words, pointing toward deliberate poisoning. Still, he held back, methodical as ever. "Mr. Peaton," he said, turning to William, "your wife's testimony may prove vital when her strength returns. Until then, we must remain vigilant. Whoever did this intended her death. That person may still believe they succeeded." His gaze lingered once more on Eleanor before he turned away. Panic clawed at Eleanor's chest. The net was drawing tighter, and she knew it. Yet she also knew the habits of Hartford society, its reluctance to scandalize its own, its instinct to shield reputations behind closed doors. Perhaps she could still maneuver, still cast enough doubt to protect herself. But as the clock ticked on and Bridget clung stubbornly to life, Eleanor realized the nightmare she feared most was upon her, the possibility that her victim would not only survive, but speak plainly, naming her as the hand that had poisoned the chalice. Bridget's words cut through the room like a blade. The bride's frail voice, trembling yet resolute, left no room for doubt. "I saw her," she whispered again, her gaze locked on Eleanor. She stirred something into the chalice. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to pause. William's face drained of color, his hand slipping from his mother's arm as though her touch had burned him. "Mother," he said hoarsely, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't try to kill Bridget." For an instant, Eleanor considered denial. But she saw in William's eyes and Dr. Harrison's steady stare that the game was lost. Her mask cracked her voice low and bitter. "I did what had to be done. That girl would have destroyed everything. Our standing, our name, our fortune, all of it would have been squandered on immigrant causes and Catholic superstitions. I acted to protect this family." William recoiled as if struck. "Protect you tried to murder the woman I love. The woman who is now my wife." His voice shook, rising with anguish. "She is not a threat, Mother. She is my future." Eleanor's composure collapsed into naked fury. "Future with her? You would give the Piton name to half-Irish mongrels with no place in society. Better the line ends than be polluted." Her words, cold and sharp, echoed in the chamber, and for a moment, even her allies in Hartford society would have shrunk from her. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his voice firm with the weight of long authority. "Mrs. Piton, enough. You have admitted your crime before witnesses. I am obliged to inform the constabulary at once." Eleanor laughed bitterly, a sound more defiance than despair. "Do you truly believe Hartford will punish me? Half the council despises the Irish as much as I do. They will call me a martyr, not a criminal." But Dr. Harrison's expression did not falter. "The law does not bend for prejudice, Mrs. Peyton. Poison is poison, whether poured by a servant or a matron." His words settled like stone over the gathering, their finality undeniable. News of the scandal spread through Hartford like wildfire. The whispers that had once mocked William's choice of bride now turned to Eleanor's monstrous act. By the time the Hartford Courant dared print a restrained version of events, the city was already alive with speculation about the trial, about the Piton legacy, about the shocking venom hidden beneath Eleanor's polished exterior. On November 20th, 1841, the trial of Eleanor Piton opened in Hartford Superior Court. Crowds pressed against the courthouse steps, desperate for a glimpse of the society matron accused of attempted murder. Inside the proceedings promised not just a legal reckoning, but a public spectacle, one that would expose the fault lines of class, religion, and prejudice that ran beneath Hartford's polished surface. The trial of Eleanor Piton became the most sensational courtroom drama Connecticut had ever seen. Reporters crowded into Hartford Superior Court, dispatching daily updates to newspapers as far away as Boston and New York. Readers devoured every detail, not only because of the crime itself, but because it laid bare the anxieties of a society divided by class, religion, and the arrival of thousands of Irish immigrants. To many, it was more than a trial. It was a battle over the future identity of New England. Judge Samuel Huntington, a man firmly rooted in Hartford's old elite, was forced to balance his personal acquaintance with Eleanor against the undeniable weight of evidence. He conducted the proceedings with strict adherence to law, reminding all present that justice could not be bent by wealth or reputation. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Morgan, wasted no time framing the case in stark terms. Eleanor, he declared, had elevated her obsession with status above basic human decency. The defendant believed her name, her fortune, her pride more valuable than the life of her son's bride. Such a belief is monstrous, and it is criminal. The evidence was damning chemical analysis, confirming arsenic in the chalice, Dr. Harrison's meticulous testimony, Bridget's eyewitness account, and most devastating of all, Eleanor's own words spoken in the doctor's office, admitting she had acted to save her family. The defense painted a different picture. Hartford's top criminal lawyer argued that Eleanor had been driven to the brink of madness by her son's reckless marriage choice. She was not a murderer, he insisted, but a mother undone by fear, her mind clouded by desperation. Yet the argument collapsed under scrutiny. Eleanor's careful acquisition of arsenic, her rehearsed plan to introduce it at the altar, and her icy composure in the aftermath, all revealed calculation, not insanity. Bridget's testimony cut through the courtroom with quiet power. Fully recovered, she described the wedding day with poise and clarity. "I do not hate Mrs. Peaton," she said softly, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. "I know she acted from love for her son, though it was twisted into something dark. But I cannot forget that she tried to end my life because she believed my heritage made me unworthy." Her dignity demolished the caricature of the unfit immigrant girl that Eleanor had tried to construct. When William took the stand, the emotional weight of the trial reached its peak. Torn between devotion to his mother and his love for Bridget, his voice trembled as he spoke. "My mother raised me to honor truth above comfort, integrity above convenience. It is in that spirit that I stand here today. I cannot deny what she has done, no matter how much I wish it were otherwise." Many in the courtroom wept openly at his testimony. The jury needed less than 2 hours. Their verdict, guilty of attempted murder. Judge Huntington's voice was heavy with solemnity as he delivered the sentence, 15 years in the Connecticut State Prison. He acknowledged Eleanor's social standing and her past contributions to Hartford society, but made clear that these could not erase the crime. When prejudice and ambition drive a person to attempted murder, he said the law must answer firmly, lest we abandon the very foundations of justice. Eleanor received her sentence with the same rigid composure she had shown throughout the trial. Not a tear escaped, nor a plea for mercy. She refused to meet the eyes of William or Bridget as she was led away in irons. The scandal left the Peaton family name in ruins. Once the embodiment of Hartford respectability, their mansion on Prospect Street became a symbol of disgrace, whispered about at tea tables and dinner parties. Though William and Bridget eventually rebuilt their lives, their love story forever carried the shadow of the mother who had tried to end it with poison at the altar. William Peaton never fully escaped the shadow of his mother's crime. Families who had once courted his friendship now shunned him, and Hartford's polite circles closed their doors. But in the midst of rejection, a few voices of progress stood beside him, and Bridget seeing in their marriage not disgrace, but the promise of change. Within months of Eleanor's conviction, William and Bridget left Hartford behind for Boston, where they built a new life far from the whispers of Connecticut society. In Boston, William thrived as a lawyer, establishing a respected practice that gave him the stability Hartford had stripped away. Bridget became the heart of their home and the soul of their wider community. She threw herself into charitable work, helping Irish immigrants secure work, housing, and education. Her quiet dignity and generous spirit transformed her into a bridge between old New England families and the desperate newcomers arriving from Ireland in droves. Together, the Peatons raised 3 children who grew into prominent citizens of Massachusetts, living proof that Eleanor's fears had been not only unfounded, but destructive. Eleanor Peaton, once the pride of Hartford's elite, served 12 long years in prison before being released for good behavior in 1853. Stripped of her fortune and social standing, she returned to Hartford, not to her mansion on Prospect Street, but to a modest boarding house. There, a broken woman, she lived out her last years in obscurity, dying in 1858 without ever reconciling with William or meeting the grandchildren whose existence she had once tried to prevent. The symbols of her crime were also reshaped into symbols of renewal. The silver chalice that had carried poison at the altar was melted down by Trinity Church, its metal donated to a fund supporting Irish immigrants. Father Matthews, shaken to the core by the violation of his sanctuary, introduced new safeguards to ensure no sacred vessel would ever again be handled in secret. The case itself lived on in New England memory as the Poisoned Chalice Trial. It was studied in law schools, whispered in parlors, and retold at firesides as a warning about the corrosive effects of prejudice and ambition. Legal scholars cited it as proof that even the highest of society could not escape justice. Physicians pointed to Dr. Harrison's role in identifying the poison as an early example of forensic medicine guiding the law. But the greatest legacy was cultural. Hartford, though slow to change, could not ignore the moral lesson. Eleanor's crime forced the city's elite to confront their own biases, and though prejudice did not vanish overnight, many families softened their views toward Irish immigrants, realizing that hatred unchecked could breed horrors far worse than intermarriage. In 1865, William returned to Hartford for the first time since the trial. Beside him was Bridget now, a dignified matron of 43, her auburn hair streaked with gray, and their 3 accomplished children. Together they visited Jonathan Peaton's grave. Locals who watched the family were struck not by scandal, but by the visible success of a union once condemned as disastrous. Bridget said nothing about forgiveness, but her quiet prayer at her father-in-law's grave told those who witnessed it that she had long since found peace. The Hartford Courant, which had covered the trial with restraint and fear decades earlier, marked the family's return